morning. It is such a blessing, such a pleasure to be here with you this morning. I know I was supposed to be here a couple of weeks ago on the fourth Sunday, and I'll plan to be here on every fourth Sunday throughout the year. But I got the flu, and I can tell you, if you've ever had the flu, you know it's not a pleasant experience, not a good time, but we got through it, we got over it, back on our feet now, and it's just a joy and a pleasure to be here with you this morning. When Jesus began his ministry, it was instantly apparent to everyone who came in contact with him that there was something different about him. The difference between Jesus and everyone else was instantly apparent when you met him. From the very start of his ministry, when John baptized him in Jordan, it was known that he was different. When he came up out of that water, we remember in the gospel accounts that it says the Spirit descended like a dove. The Father himself spoke from heaven and said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." That's different. No one else has ever had that happen to them. When Jesus concluded his first public sermon, the Sermon on the Mount recorded in Matthew's chapter through 7, say in Matthew chapter 7, verses 28 and 29, that the people were amazed. They were in awe, and they said, "No one teaches like this man. He doesn't teach like the scribes and the Pharisees. He teaches as one who has authority." Jesus was different. Jesus, throughout his ministry, gave life back to those who were dying of sicknesses that there was no cure for. Jesus, throughout his ministry, gave freedom back to those who were enslaved by disablement. On the cross, when Jesus died and his blood was shed, he changed everything for you and me. His blood now stands as the most transformative substance in all of history. It gives us freedom from the sin in our lives. Jesus changed and still today changes everything. This morning, I want to take a look at an account of a man who is just one among many that Jesus changed the life of. And this man was a hurting individual, a lost individual, and one who found what he was looking for in Christ. In Luke chapter 19, we find this man named Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus. We already read the account. It was so capably read just a few moments ago. But let's notice just a couple of things about Zacchaeus as we get started. Of course, we know that Zacchaeus, he's of course one of our favorite VBS stories, because if you remember the song, Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. Zacchaeus, he was a little guy, and that's somewhat important to the story due to his actions that we'll get to later, but we need to realize, maybe just if for nothing else, the facts of the matter, just how small Zacchaeus was. In Judea, in Jesus' day, the average height of a full-grown male man was between 5'2" and 5'6". So if that's the average height, we think of that as, pretty short. Well, Zacchaeus, if he was a wee little man, he might have been less than 5 foot tall. He was a real little guy. But Zacchaeus, his importance is not due to his stature. Zacchaeus, we see, was a tax collector, and a chief tax collector at that. We'll get to the importance of that here in just a moment. But the main characteristic of Zacchaeus, the main thing that we want to key in on, what Jesus changed for him, is the fact that Zacchaeus, like so many people today, suffered from the soul-eating problem of selfishness. Selfishness. Selfishness is something that the world, that culture at large, especially Western culture, champions. They promote it. Oftentimes in more subtle ways. They don't just come right out and say, "Hey, you should be selfish." That's still maybe looked down upon. but in little ways, in small things. The world tells us to be selfish, to put me first, not other people. Sometimes it is a very overt and obvious thing. Think about the world of sports, a world that is fueled by ego, by selfishness, by players who are putting themselves first. If you keep up with any of the basketball stuff that's been going on, we see all of these players who are saying, I know I may have been with this team for 10 or 15 years and I've played for them. The fans love me, the city loves me, but I want to get out of here. I don't like my coach, or I don't like my teammates, or I don't like the money I'm making, so I need to make the right choice for me. So I need to leave. I need to get out of here. Think about some of the famous selfish sports quotes in history. We see from Muhammad Ali, perhaps the greatest boxer to ever live. He once said, not the greatest. Good start. It doesn't get better. He said, I'm not the greatest. I'm double the greatest. I knock him out and I pick the round. Well, perhaps he had the skill to back up such a statement, but still, what ego, what arrogance, what selfishness. Deion Sanders, one of the media's very favorite people in the past couple of years since he's been the coach at Colorado, back in his playing days, he once said, well, of course I ride in a limo. How else does a superstar get around? Michael Jordan, perhaps the greatest basketball player to ever live, he said one time to his coach, of all people, well, coach, there's no I in team, but there's an I in win, elevating himself above the importance of the team. Sports is full of these big characters who have great egos, but they put self-advancement, they put accomplishment or money or fame oftentimes in front of their team's overall success. And most of the time, we see that that doesn't end up working out too well. That ends up harming them and their team in the long run. The world tells us that to be selfish, well, it's not just okay, it's what you're supposed to do. It's preferred. The world says every morning when you wake up and you look in the mirror, you need to say, I'm the best. You need to say, I want all of the money that I can get. I want all of the fame, the fortune. I want the big house and the nice car. And certainly, there's nothing inherently wrong with pursuing nice things in life. But we have to make sure that they're in their proper place, in their proper priority. And certainly being selfish is not the proper priority. Perhaps if outside of just the material things, selfishness even becomes more apparent. The world says people need to work around my schedule. What I have planned is clearly the most important. And so if somebody needs me, well, they'll have to just find a spot in my schedule and I'll pencil them in there. And if I have to change my schedule, well, they just may fall by the wayside. They need to work around me. People say that my mood, my feelings, my opinions on a matter, well, they're the most important because they're mine. And clearly I'm right. I can never be wrong. And because of that, you need to go ahead and just admit that my feelings on a matter, my opinions are what needs to be the standard. This attitude is prevalent throughout our entire culture in almost every facet of life. And Zacchaeus, well, he's a man who had lived selfishly. And we don't ever see the text specifically say Zacchaeus was a selfish man. So how do we know that he was? We know Zacchaeus' condition because of his position. Zacchaeus was a tax collector. Rome at this time ruled all of the known Western world, all the way from Italy, where its capital was, up into the northern regions, all around the Mediterranean, over into North Africa. Rome was the superpower that no one at this time messed with. And of course, we know what happens when a group of people comes in and takes over. Taxes are instituted. Somebody's got to pay for everything, and so it might as well be the people. And their tax system was very, very strict. In its most basic sense, it served the same purpose as ours today, paying for the roads and for the projects and for the military. But Rome's tax system differed quite greatly in especially the way that they collected taxes. When Rome would come into a region such as Israel and take over, they would give the people themselves the opportunity to be the tax collectors. And this, on its face, seems a very good idea. You know, the best way to get people involved and to make people happy is to include them in something. And so, you give the people the opportunity to collect the taxes, and maybe they'll be a little more favorable in giving their buddy over here the money instead of giving it to a Roman soldier. Well, unfortunately for Rome, that didn't really work too well. Pretty much nobody was a fan of tax collectors, just like they aren't today. It didn't matter if it was your buddy or not. But when Rome came into this territory and gave the residents this option of being the job of a tax collector, they didn't hold interviews such as we think of when a job becomes open. They auctioned the job off to the highest bidder. They would get a group of individuals, whoever was interested, and you could bid on the job, and whoever wanted to pay the most money got it. But then once you got the job, in order to make sure that you were going to loyally do what you were supposed to do, you actually had to pay a very exorbitant amount of money to Rome. This amount could be as much as what the entire district's tax would be for a specific cycle, thus pretty much ensuring that you're going to do your job and you're going to do it right. Now, that sounds like a pretty high financial investment and risk on the front end, but many people were willing to do it because once you became that Roman tax collector, of course, there was a minimum you had to collect. But Rome turned a blind eye to collecting more. They could collect as much money as they could squeeze out of people, and whatever was over the tax line, they got to keep. And many of them did this to fund exorbitant lifestyles. It was very common for the tax collector to be the richest man in town with the nicest house and the most servants and the best food. And they did this by extorting the money from the people. And they could do this however they wanted. If you were walking down the street and the local tax collector walked up to you and said, "It's time to pay," well, I paid last week. Doesn't matter. In Rome, if they demanded the money, you had to give it. If you refused to pay the taxes, well, they didn't have any mercy for that either. Your family would be thrown in prison, and as soon as possible, you would be sold into slavery. This was some serious business. Their selfishness, that is, the tax collectors, didn't just extend to the embezzlement that they inflicted on people. Their selfishness was deeper than that. To their family, to their friends, to those who were loyal to their home country, these tax collectors were viewed as nothing more than traitors. The cost that this job came at socially was very high. The Talmud, which is a collection of rabbinical teachings that the Jews hold very close even to this day, puts tax collectors on the same level as murderers and robbers. They were viewed as the very scum of society. They were disowned by their families. They were shunned by those who would have been their friends even days prior. They were ostracized from society entirely. And so Zacchaeus, being a chief tax collector, well, he would not have been viewed favorably by any. So why take the job? Why decide to betray your homeland, be ostracized from your family? Selfishness. That desire for those riches, it was too much for many people, and they became selfish. Sure, Zacchaeus was rich, but he was rich and lonely, selfishly choosing the world over his family, over his friends, and ultimately over God. But selfishness has consequences, even today. If we are selfish, we can lose friends and family. We can lose relationship with God. What you gain materially or status wise is never going to be worth the emotional and spiritual ramifications that selfishness brings. But the world doesn't tell you that. And I'm sure it didn't tell Zacchaeus that either. Because at its very core, what selfishness is very simple and very profound. Selfishness at its core is putting something in the place of God in your heart. It's nothing short of idolatry. When you put self first, you make self God. And so many people in our world today do that. And it seems that's what Zacchaeus has done to get himself into this situation. But when we finally get to Zacchaeus' story in Luke 19, it seems that perhaps his selfishness might be fading. In verse 1 of Luke 19, we read, "He entered Jericho," that is Jesus, "and was passing through. And behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was. But on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, 'Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today.' So he hurried and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, that is, the Jews, they all grumbled, 'He has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner.' And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, 'Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold.' And Jesus said to him, 'Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost.'" Such a simple and short story, and yet in these 10 verses, we see a man who is selfish, who is rich but lonely. We see him change from this chief tax collector into one who Jesus says is blessed and has salvation. How does this happen? How does he go from selfishness to selflessness? Well, as you might have guessed from the beginning of the lesson, it's because Jesus changes everything. But let's take a little bit deeper of a dive and see just how Jesus changed everything. Zacchaeus does 3 things in this text that lead him from selfish to selfless. First, we see in verse 3 that Zacchaeus sought the Lord. He sought the Lord. It says he was seeking to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. Why do you think Zacchaeus was looking for Jesus? Well, there could be a number of reasons. Perhaps it was nothing more than curiosity. At this point in Jesus' ministry, he is well known. He is a superstar, if you will. He's been all across the region of Galilee, his home base, of course, being Capernaum for the early part of his ministry. He's been to Jerusalem multiple times. He's been to Samaria. Jesus has been all over the place. Everybody knows when he is coming to town. Perhaps it's curiosity, or he's heard the stories about Jesus, and maybe that's all. Maybe that's the only reason that he wants to see the Lord. I have to think it has to be deeper than that. Otherwise, he wouldn't have gone to the lengths that he did in order to see him. Perhaps Zacchaeus' motivation here is that this life of rich, glorious living, perhaps it's losing its luster. Perhaps this selfishness that he's had for so many years is fading away, and he's looking for something deeper. He's looking for that hole in his heart that needs to be filled. Zacchaeus, though the reason he looks for the Lord is unknown, his resolve is clearly evident. We see that he gets there, he sees the crowd, he says, I can't see over everybody's heads. What am I going to do? He runs ahead, he climbs up into this sycamore tree in order to just get a glimpse of the Lord. Zacchaeus probably doesn't think he's going to get to talk to him. I'm sure he definitely doesn't know he'll be hosting him at this point. He just does this to get just a look at Jesus. And notice, we don't think of it as a normal thing for someone to climb up into a tree today. If a full-grown man, climbs up into a tree in the middle of downtown, we're going to think, well, he's kind of a nut job. What's he doing up there? We don't really see that normally, and that wasn't a normal thing in Jesus' day either. For Zacchaeus to go to this length of even really incurring a bit of embarrassment on himself speaks to how much he wanted to see Jesus. Maybe Zacchaeus did this because he knew of the life-changing power that Jesus had. Maybe he just did it because he was curious. We don't know. But the first step in Zacchaeus' change of heart is that he sought the Lord. If we are going to change our hearts, if we are going to encourage the people who we are surrounded by in the world every day to change their hearts, the first step is the same for us as it was for Zacchaeus. We have to seek the Lord. We have to seek the one who has the power to change everything. If we never seek him, we're never going to find him. But if we seek him, we are promised that we will find him. And Zacchaeus did. So number one, he sought the Lord. But secondly, we read on beginning in verse 5 and find that he welcomed the Lord. He welcomed the Lord. Beginning in verse 5, we read, "And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, 'Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today.' So he hurried and came down and received him joyfully." He received him joyfully. Now, Jesus, he's a surprise guest of Zacchaeus. I don't think Zacchaeus knew that Jesus was going to be coming. And in fact, really what Jesus did is he invited himself over. And of course, the Lord has a little bit more freedom to do such things. We probably wouldn't like it too much if people did that to us. Hey, I'm coming to your house later. Hope you have dinner ready. We don't really have that happen too much today. But Jesus says to Zacchaeus, "I'm coming to your house." And this is a big deal. This is a huge deal. Remember, Zacchaeus, he's this tax collector. He's this one that people say, "Oh no, we don't even talk to him. We don't even look at him. If he's coming at us on the sidewalk, we're just gonna turn into the store or step away or put some distance between us." We don't associate with those kind of people. And yet Jesus, in this great crowd, says, "You, the guy up there in the tree, the guy who is known to be the tax collector, the guy who, by the way, I've never met, but I know the name of, it's Zacchaeus." Jesus calls him by name. That's important. "I'm going to your house today. You're the one who I want to dine with. You're the one who I want to be my host. You're the one I want to spend my time with." And Zacchaeus here, he's put at a crossroads. He has two options. He can either say, "Yeah, come on over, Jesus. I'd love to welcome you in. We'll have dinner. We'll do whatever." Or he could say, "Well, I'm not sure I want you to come over today. The house isn't clean. We gotta clean up a little bit. The laundry's not done." Zacchaeus welcomes the Lord. He shows him hospitality. He welcomes him into his home, and by so doing, he welcomes in Jesus' teaching. He welcomes in Jesus' influence. He welcomes in the Lord into his life. Notice how the Jews react. In verse 7, They saw it, they all grumbled. He has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. Now, for most rabbis in this particular day and age, this would have been very out of character. To eat with a tax collector, to spend time with this sinner, one who is on the same level as a murderer or a robber, well, that would be unheard of. But in fact, if we take a look at all of the gospel account, we see that for Jesus, this is just a day in the life. This is what Jesus did. This was his usual practice. We can look in places such as Matthew 9 and verse 10, such as Mark 2 and verse 15, and see that it was a completely normal thing for Jesus to choose to spend his time with the lowly of society. He is often seen eating with those described as tax collectors and sinners. And this is important. Jesus only had a limited amount of time here on this earth. His ministry was but 3 years long, and he did not choose to spend his time with the religious elite in the temple. He did not choose to spend his time in his hometown preaching to those he had grown up with. He didn't even choose to spend his time with the middle class of the land. He chose to spend the majority of his time and his work with those who most of the world wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. We need to be very mindful, very intentional with our evangelism, and realize that if Jesus could spend time with those people who the world said that those are the people we ought to be taking the gospel to, maybe more than anyone else. But Zacchaeus welcomes the Lord. He welcomes him into his home. He welcomes him into his life. And this is an important next step. There are many in the world who have sought out Jesus. There are many in the world who, in seeking, have found him. But then, when they find him, well, maybe he's not what they thought he was. Maybe his teachings are a little harder to swallow than they thought they were. And they don't welcome him into their lives. What about us? We seek the Lord, certainly. But when we find him, we find his teaching, when we have to apply those things to our lives, do we welcome them in? Do we put aside self and say, what I was, well, that's no longer what I am. I'll change because Jesus asks me to. Or do we say, no, I'm going to be selfish. I'm going to be what I want to be, and asking me to change, well, Jesus, that's just too much. Zacchaeus sought the Lord, and Zacchaeus welcomed the Lord. But number 3, Zacchaeus obeyed the Lord. Beginning in verse 8, we read, Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. We don't know if Jesus told Zacchaeus to sell his possessions, to give back what he had taken, or not. We don't have it recorded that he did, so perhaps this is just Zacchaeus responding to what he already knows the Lord would have him to do. But either way, Zacchaeus had an understanding that he needed to restore the things that he had taken. He had an understanding that what he had been doing, the way he had been living, that could not endure. He couldn't do that anymore. And in fact, he had to right the wrongs of the past. This was a major change for Zacchaeus. This was a shift in the way that he lived every single day. Notice the fervor, the intensity that Zacchaeus has with this. Not only does he say, I'm going to restore the things I've defrauded. Surely that would have been enough, right? Just to give back what he'd taken. Not only does he give back what he's taken, he gives it back fourfold. 4 times the amount that he's taken, he's going to give back to those he's taken it from. And not just that, that would be incredible in and of itself. But he says he's going to sell half his goods, half of everything he owns, and he's going to give it to the poor. The intensity, fervor with which Zacchaeus changes everything that he's been doing sets a precedent, sets an example for us. Realize when we bring Jesus into our life, when we submit ourselves to the Savior, the way in which we change is immense. The way in which we must change our lives, it's intense, and it calls for sacrifice. But just like Zacchaeus, we need to be willing to pay the cost. Are we willing to obey Jesus? Are we willing to make the major life changes that are necessary in order to live for Him as we should? Many seek Him. In fact, many welcome Him. But there are perhaps far fewer who welcome Him and obey Him. We need to be among that number. And oftentimes when we talk about welcoming Jesus and obeying Him in our lives, we're thinking about, of course, the steps of salvation. We're thinking about baptism and becoming a Christian, and certainly the importance of that is immense. But for those of us who are already Christians, we need to realize this is a lifelong process. We are never going to be perfect. One of my favorite quotes from an older gentleman I know back home is, he often says, and he's one of the smartest Bible scholars I've ever met in my life, but he often says, I don't have it all figured out, and I know you don't either, because God's still working on both of us. That's always going to be true as long as we live. We need to be willing to make every change in order to be as much like Christ as we possibly can be. Zacchaeus sought the Lord, and he found him. Zacchaeus welcomed the Lord into his home and into his life, and he obeyed him. And Zacchaeus, well, his life was changed because Jesus changes everything. We don't need to overlook the Lord's words in verses 9 and 10 because, especially for Zacchaeus, they are immensely important. These words would have meant the world to him. When Jesus says, today salvation has come to this house since he also is a son of Abraham, to us, it just seems like Jesus is making an acknowledgement that Zacchaeus is a Jew. But remember, Zacchaeus has been cast out of his family. He's been cast out of his culture and his society. To the Jews, Zacchaeus was not a Jew. He was born a Jew, but they had basically revoked that title from him. For him to have said, I'm a son of Abraham, they would have been irate if he was to make such a declaration. But Jesus says to him, I'm welcoming you back into the family. What you've lost, it's being restored to you. You also are a son of Abraham. And then, of course, the importance of verse 10 is immense even to this day. Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. Jesus changes everything. He changed everything for Zacchaeus. For those of us who are already changed everything for us. For those in the audience this morning who are not Christians, He can change everything for you. What applications must we make to this story as we draw towards our conclusion? First, we have to ask ourselves constantly, who is our God? Who is the one sitting on the throne of our heart? Is it self? Is it me, my desires, what I want to do? Or is it Christ? It must be Christ. Nothing can take His place on the throne of my heart if I'm to live faithfully. The question this morning is really quite simple. Are you Am I willing to seek the Lord, to welcome Him, and to simply obey what He asks us to do? This morning, if you're not a Christian and you have not yet taken the steps to become a child of God, it would be our greatest joy to help you in doing that. Perhaps you have been thinking about this for quite some time. Perhaps this is something that's been on your mind, and maybe you're ready this morning to make that commitment to put on Christ in baptism and to begin walking faithfully with Him. Or maybe this is the first time you've ever heard about this and you want to study further. We would love to study with you deeper and further to help you understand that Jesus can change your life. But maybe this morning you're ready to make that change, and we would love the opportunity to help you with that this morning. But for those of us who are Christians, are we focused? Are we intentional about continuing to make Jesus the most important part of our life? Or do we get distracted? Do we allow other things to creep in and slowly push Him off the throne? We have to be intentional. We have to be very careful. And this morning, if you've strayed away, if you've allowed self or anything else to take His place on the throne, we would love to pray with you and pray for you. We would love to give you the support that the church is supposed to give each other. This morning, if you have any need to respond to the Lord's invitation, we would ask you to do so and come forward as we stand and sing together.